Hello and welcome to Karen's class again. We're in the middle of exam season and I just wanted to go over 31 literary devices that I'm sure will be very helpful for those of you who are preparing for your IB English, GCSE English, AP English Literature, and AP English Language exams. So let's get started right away. First of all, I know that a lot of you have been exposed to the terms literary device, literary technique, literary elements, but sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because we use those interchangeably a lot of the time. Let's go through some basic disambiguation that should help you be absolutely sure that you're not mixing these terms up, you're not using them in any way that might detract from your final excellent result on the test. So first of all, a literary device is any aspect of literature which we can recognize, identify, interpret, and or analyze. Literary elements and literary techniques are both considered literary devices. So in that sense, it's a specific category that is a higher tier category that encompasses the other two. So literary techniques next are more specific and deliberate constructions of language that authors can use to convey meaning. An author will use a literary technique with a single word or a phrase or a particular group of words or phrases at a single point in a given text. Literary techniques are not necessarily present in every text, and they impart specific characteristics to each text. So usually in your prompts, for example, you will be asked to analyze literary techniques more often than not. Next, literary elements are characteristics of a text, and they are not used per se by authors, and we tend to derive what they are from reading the text. And most, if not all, texts feature literary elements that may be derived by the reader. For example, a plot would be an element of literature or a literary element. When in doubt, just go with the term literary device because you can't go wrong with that. Now let's look at these literary devices in more depth and detail. First off, we have alliteration, which a lot of you have probably heard of and have learned about. What is alliteration? Alliteration is the repetition of usually initial consonant sounds within close proximity, usually in two or more consecutive words or syllables within the same sentence or line. For example, the infamous tongue twister, "She sells seashells by the seashore." All of these words start with S, except for by and the. And so you can hear the susurrus, the S repeating itself, sounds like this sound of waves. Wild and woolly, threatening throngs. This is another example of alliteration. So next we have anthropomorphism, which is different from personification. We're going to get to personification later on. But so anthropomorphism is basically a situation in which animals or inanimate objects are portrayed in a story as people by walking, talking, or having arms and legs and limbs or facial features that you would normally associate with a person. So for example, we have the sentence, "Beauty and the Beast is replete with the anthropomorphization of cutlery, furniture, and other such household items." Next, we have the word allusion, and the verb form, of course, is to allude to, so be careful with the preposition that you're going to use with this word in verb form. Allusion refers to an indirect reference to a person, a place, a thing, an event, an idea, or even a cultural reference. And so, for example, you can have something like a biblical allusion. Right? So Paradise Lost features many biblical allusions, such as the Leviathan, which is a mythical sea creature mentioned in the book of Job. Next, we have allegory. What is an allegory? An allegory is a story in which every aspect is representative or symbolic of something else, something larger, something abstract, or more important historical or geopolitical event. Now, allegory can be used in its adjective form as allegorical. So you can refer to a story as being an allegorical story. Examples of this word in use: the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell is an allegory for the Russian Revolution in which characters represent historical entities. Or, in Lord of the Flies, William Golding has created an allegory of the bestial nature of humanity, crafting characters that depict certain facets of the human condition. So there you see the usage of the term allegory. Next, we're going to look at analogy. An analogy is a parallel between disparate ideas, people, things, or events that is more elaborate than a metaphor or a simile. So, a very famous quote from Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word. What smell is sweet?" In this case, the rose is analogous to a name. Next, blank verse. Blank verse is non-rhyming poetry, usually written in iambic pentameter. So Shakespeare frequently utilizes blank verse in his plays. That would be an example of how you would use blank verse in a sentence. Next, we have literary device number 7, which is dialogue. Dialogue, as you probably well know, refers to characters using direct and indirect speech in conversation with each other. For example, the dialogue of The Crucible features many antiquated expressions that are true to the time period in which the Salem witch trials took place. That would be an example of how to use the word dialogue. Next, for literary device number 8, we have the term colloquialism. What is a colloquialism? A colloquialism is an informal piece of dialogue or verbal expression that is used in casual, everyday conversation. For example, John Steinbeck deliberately uses slang, dialect, and colloquial speech in Of Mice and Men in order to impart authenticity to the dialogue. Next, literary device number 9 is diction. Diction refers to the word choice, phraseology, and writing or speaking style of a writer or a character as characterized by vocabulary. For example, you can use this word in a sentence like this: "The informal diction in Huckleberry Finn imparts a folksy and colloquial tone." So another use of the word colloquial. Always keep in mind, though, this is something that students really frequently get a little confused about, and this is something that you do need to disambiguate, is that diction and syntax are not the same. You should not confuse these two. Diction refers to word choice, syntax refers to word order or sentence structure choice. So there's that difference there. Literary device number 10, we have irony. Irony refers to language that expresses the opposite of the literal meaning. There are many different types of irony, and chief among them, the types of irony that you should know are types of irony such as verbal irony. Verbal irony refers to speech that conveys the opposite of its literal meaning. Situational irony refers to an event that occurs that is the opposite of what is expected. Dramatic irony usually is applied to theater or literature, and this refers to an instance in which the audience knows something that the characters do not. So let's look at some examples of this irony, shall we? First of all, an example of verbal irony would be something like when you say, "Wow, great shot," after your friend misses the target. It's kind of not very polite. You shouldn't say that to your friend. You should commiserate with your friend and comfort your friend. Next, an example of situational irony is, for example, in O. Henry's short story, The Gift of the Magi. The husband sells his watch to buy his wife a comb, but he doesn't know that the wife has sold her hair to buy her husband a new watch strap. And so that's a case of situational irony, but it's depicted in a beautiful way, showcasing the young love between this poor but loving couple. Next, an example of dramatic irony would be Macbeth. Next, an example of dramatic irony would be the situation in which Macbeth is shocked and responds with disbelief when the weird sisters say, "Thane of Cawdor." Ironically, unbeknownst to him, unbeknownst to Macbeth, Macbeth had actually been granted the title Thane of Cawdor by King Duncan in the previous scene. So we know it, the weird sisters know it, Macbeth was the only one who actually had not known this fact. Literary device number 11, we see euphemism. What is a euphemism? A euphemism refers to a less provocative term being used in place of a more explicit or unpleasant one. For example, if you say something like, he was let go, that is a euphemism for he was fired. If you say she passed away, it's a euphemism for she died. Literary device number 12, we have exposition. Exposition is more like a literary element, but again, as we saw, literary device encompasses the whole spectrum of these categories, so we can refer to exposition safely as a literary device. Exposition is effectively when an author interrupts a story in order to explain something, usually to provide important background information. So for example, when you watch movies often rely on montages, flashbacks, and dialogue for exposition to inform the viewer what went on in the scene prior, or what went on in the protagonist's life before we got a chance to meet him in the film. Next, literary device number 13 is figurative language. This is a term that you most definitely have heard of. Figurative language refers to any use of language in which the actual literal meaning and the intended meaning of the words differ. Many of the literary techniques we learn comprise figurative language, including metaphor, simile, hyperbole, personification, onomatopoeia, verbal irony, oxymoron. The list goes on. Most of the words in this list are indeed examples of figurative language, and you will see this term crop up very often on prompts. An example of a sentence that uses this term would be something like this. In the Shakespearean sonnet, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" the speaker utilizes figurative language, such as imagery, to compare his lover to a summer's day. Moving on, literary device number 14 is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing refers to situations in which future events in a story, or perhaps the outcome, are suggested or implied by the author before they actually occur within the story's plot itself. So, for example, in the first chapter of The Red Pony, the protagonist Jody is shown feeling uneasy after noticing buzzards flying low to the ground. This foreshadows, unfortunately, the death that will occur later on in the story. Literary device number 15 is hyperbole. What is hyperbole? Hyperbole is a statement that is obviously and intentionally exaggerated. It is the opposite or the antonym of, for example, an understatement. Very good. So hyperbole, an example of hyperbole would be something like this. I'm so hungry, I could eat a whole live elephant. Is an obvious use of hyperbole because no one with a normal human stomach capacity could feasibly eat a whole live elephant. Well, sometimes I feel like I could. Idiom is a figure of speech that is indecipherable based on the words alone, but is culturally understood to mean a certain specific thing. For example, if you say something like, "I'm feeling under the weather," that's an idiom because it makes no sense. How can you be under the weather? Or everyone's under the weather. But even though it makes no sense if you take it literally, cultural conventions of speech allow us to infer that when someone says, "I'm feeling under the weather," that person probably isn't feeling too great. They're not in tip-top shape, which is another idiom. Next, literary device number 17, we have imagery. Imagery is language which describes things in detail while appealing to the senses, using words to substitute for and create sensory stimulation, including visual imagery, sound imagery, tactile imagery, the list goes on. An example of imagery being used in a sentence is something like this. The tactile and colorful imagery used to depict the walls of the nursery, hot pink and tacky with Crayola markings, conveys the chaotic, childish glee that characterizes the toddlers. Next, literary device number 18, juxtaposition. Juxtaposition is a literary device that refers to when you place contrasting elements together for emphasis. Let's take a look at this very famous quote from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. So this juxtaposition of contrasting elements, used masterfully by Charles Dickens, emphasizes that disconnect and makes these contrasts stand out, makes the impact of these words fall all the more harder. Next, literary device number 19 is malapropism. A malapropism is an incorrect word that is used intentionally or unintentionally in place of a similar sounding one, sometimes used for humorous effect. For example, in William Shakespeare's Much Ado Without Nothing, Act 3, Scene 5, we have a line like this. Our watch, sir, have indeed comprehended 2 auspicious persons. The malapropisms in this case are the misuse of comprehended in place of apprehended. What does it mean to apprehend someone? It means you catch them. What does it mean to comprehend? It means you understand, right? And what is auspicious? Auspicious means good luck, having good luck. But suspicious means you're suspicious of that person, right? And so this is a humorous or comic use of these particular malapropisms. Moving on, literary device number 20, we have metaphor. I'm sure most, if not all of you know what a metaphor is, but a metaphor is a comparison of 2 ideas, events, objects, or people that does not use the words like or as. For example, in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 2, we have Romeo saying these words. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief. In this scene, the sun is a metaphor for Juliet. Literary device 21, we have mood. The general feeling the speaker evokes in the reader through the atmosphere, descriptions, and other features is called a mood. For example, in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, we have the opening lines that start like this. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. So in these opening lines, Edgar Allan Poe evokes an air of mystery and sets a dark mood, which you can easily see. Literary device number 22, we have onomatopoeia. In onomatopoeia, sounds are spelled out as words, or words describing sounds actually sound like the sounds they describe. For example, in the epic verse of Beowulf, the use of assonance and onomatopoeia can be seen in the scene in which the sword rings and sings through the air. This auditory invitation creates the image of a battle for the audience. Of course, you don't have to go so far as Beowulf. You can just say words like zap, zing, pow, ouch. All of these are examples of onomatopoeia. Literary device number 23, we have oxymoron. An oxymoron is a pairing of seemingly contradictory terms used to convey emphasis or tension. If you say something like a fine mess, this is an oxymoronic characterization because fine is typically associated with beauty and order, while mess is often the opposite, but they're placed together. Literary device number 24 is paradox. A paradox is a situation in which an impossible situation is created, even though it cannot logically or realistically exist, because different elements of it cancel each other out. For example, in George Orwell's dystopian novel, 1984, Doublethink refers to the sort of paradox in which history is altered or revised, and everyone knows that this is so, but no one is allowed to mention that history has been changed, because everyone is made to think that history has never changed. Next we have personification. Personification refers to the literary device wherein we lend human descriptors to non-humans. In personification, the non-human entities are not necessarily thought to behave in human-like ways, but they're just described in these terms. They're just given these specific descriptors. For example, if you say something like, "The shadows danced on the wall of Plato's cave." Although shadows cannot dance, the lending of the human action personifies those shadows and gives them life. It seems to make them more animated, more sinister perhaps, or more lively than if this literary device had not been used at all. Literary device number 26 is repetition. Repetition, quite literally, refers to multiple instances of a word or a phrase being used in succession for emphasis. So, for example, in Robert Frost's very well-known poem, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, we have verse like this. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." And the repetition emphasizes the length of the speaker's journey. Note that when you are incorporating your analysis of literary devices into your description or analysis of a given literary work, try to see not just that it's been used, but how that serves the author's purpose, what effect that has on the audience. This is always going to help you take your writing to that next level, take your analysis, give it that level of complexity and sophistication that, the graders are looking for, but also that's going to give you that extra satisfaction of knowing that you've done a really good job, really well. Next, literary device number 27, we have satire. Satire is the structured and systemic use of irony within or throughout a given work in order to critique or expose an entity, behavior, social problem, vice, etc. Satire is a tier above sarcasm, for example. You can have sarcastic elements strewn throughout a text that is not satirical, but a work of satire is something more like, if you look in the example, Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. A Modest Proposal is a satirical essay written by Jonathan Swift in which he sardonically and satirically suggests that members of the rich establishment may as well eat the children of the poor, given what terrible conditions the upper class is creating and maintaining for these impoverished children. And so when you have a work of satire, this is usually being used with a very specific purpose in mind, to criticize, to critique a very specific thing. Next, literary device 28, we have similes. What is a simile? A simile is different from a metaphor. Remember, a metaphor does not use words like or as, but a simile is a comparison between objects, events, or people that does use like or as. So they're literally similar. Let's look at this example. Lovely verse from William Wordsworth's poem Daffodils. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills." Lonely as a cloud is a simile, comparing the speaker's state of isolation to that of a cloud. Some other very famous and well-known similes, for example, are "My love is like a red, red rose." If you said "My love is an undying rose," that would be a metaphor. Literary device number 29, we have symbolism. Now, symbolism, quite literally, is something that symbolizes or represents a larger concept or idea than itself. For example, in Macbeth, the spot Lady Macbeth cannot get off her dress is a symbol of her conscience, which is stained with guilt. Literary device number 30, we have synecdoche. What is a synecdoche? A synecdoche is a literary device in which the part represents the whole. So, for example, if you say something like, all hands on deck, your hand is being used to signify the whole of the sailor, the whole body of the sailor. And each hand represents each sailor. Or, I need a head count by morning. If you say something like that, then head represents a whole person in this case. If you say, nice wheels, you're using wheels to designate the whole of the car. Finally, we have the last literary device of the day, which is tone. Tone refers to the speaker or narrator's attitude towards the subject of the piece. It is distinct from mood in that it is not necessarily used to evoke a particular feeling in the reader. So the tone is more like how the author feels. The mood is how the reader is supposed to feel, or how the author intends for the reader to feel. There's the difference. So let's read this very interesting example, again from Robert Frost, in his poem, The Road Not Taken. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. And when he says with a sigh, the speaker of the poem is evoking a tone of wistfulness and relief all at once, using those words. That's it with our literary devices for today. I hope this has been helpful. I hope this is going to help you become the best writer that you will and can be. And I wish you best of luck on all of your future exams. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, comment below. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!